in this last tutorial in the series, I will show you how to add color to the black and white image we created in the previous video, and how to create the hexagon pattern, the grid, all the little details you can see, and how we can blend them together using blending modes and a few little tricks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place all these layers into a new comp. I'm going to call it text smear effect. First of all, I created shape layer. Again, added 2 fractal noise effects with a bunch of settings, as you can see. A little bit of complexity, blending mode multiply, and blending mode again multiply. Now here's a little trick for you. If you set both blending modes of the first and second fractal noise to something like multiply, they both will blend with each other and with the color of the shape layer as well. So for example, if I change it from gray to red, as you can see, the whole thing changed. I added simple time times 75 and 125 expressions to the evolution. So simply I can animate the effect itself. And last touch was simply modifying the seed number of the second fractal layer itself. So it's a little bit different than the previous one. Now this will be my background effect. And what I want to do is simply colorize the whole image, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is add adjustment layer, simply add Colorama effect. Now this is pretty intense from the start. So this effect is using intensity, or you can use lightness or other values to get different phases. So how each color is being represented. You can think about this as like a heat map, which this being the hottest, I suppose, and all the gradient gets mapped, and again to the very, very dark spot, it gets wrapped around again in a cycle. So that's how it looks. So to change it, you can simply remove or add those triangles, or use like a preset. Now to change those colors, you simply double click on the triangle. The problem is you get this old school color picker. So to pick specific colors, you actually have to use like a layer as your sample board, for example, like I'm doing now. Now this effect is pretty strong as it is. So the way I'm going to blend this with all the colors is simply using the blending mode. By using something like color, this effect gets applied to all the color values and doesn't affect the brightest values. So our text layer itself will be plain white as it was before. That's why it was important in the previous tutorial to set up a gradient map, so the brightest points are literally off the displaced streaks over here. Now to further customize this, I'm going to duplicate the text layer. I'm going to actually drag it above the Colorama and add shift channels effect. Now shift channels, it simply allows us to take a single channel of the layer and turn off the others. In this case, I'm only going to leave the red one on, then I'm going to paste it on the second shift 2 layer, and I'm going to leave the blue as blue. And to create this kind of halo effect, I'm simply just going to move the one layer twice to the one side and the other twice to the other side. So we have this kind of halo fake 3D effect. Now to blend this with what's happening underneath, you can simply pick one of the additive modes. So for example, if I pick add, the whole thing, as you can see, you have a slight discoloration on the edges, it gets blended in. The text itself stays white, so the brightest parts won't be affected. Actually, I'm going to move this twice more. I want to make sure you can actually see this with the screen recording and YouTube compression. Now, I don't like this effect being so strong, especially like around here. So what you can do is add fast color blur and blur this a little bit, maybe like 5 pixels, by only horizontal way. I just want this to go side to side. Make sure repeat edge pixels are on, so all the stuff at the bottom will definitely get taken into account. I'm going to copy this and paste it on the red layer. So now this is a much more subtle. Okay, so we've got our gentle glow, we've got our Colorama doing all the colors. Now I'm going to create one more shape layer. Change this to width and height. Create a quick keyframe. Connect one with the other. Turn this off. So this way I can modify this easily and have perfect squares. Now to create this hexagon effect I had at the beginning, you have to add CC HexTile. So this HexTile effect, it folds the previous layer or the folds what's visible within itself. So if you do something like fold seamlessly, you get this perfect hexagon effect. If you turn off this grid, it disappears. No idea why. So next thing I'm going to do is connect radius with the width. So by adding quick keyframes, I can easily just connect them with expressions. There you go. And this way I can modify one and the other one will follow. Okay, to make this whole thing more interesting, I'm going to add Turbulent Displace effect. So this will kind of smear the hexagon grid all over the place. And I'm actually increase maybe the size to like 50 and change the border to something small like 1 or so. Now the Turbulent Displace is actually a really interesting effect. It doesn't do anything by itself, so we have to add either keyframe or expression to the evolution option. So now this effect will warp and move around. Just play with the values till you get something you like. Actually, if I make this a little bit smaller and denser, so now we don't have such a uniform effect as before. So that's before and that's after. So it gives a little bit more depth. It's not 100% uniform. So now what I want to do is I want to combine this effect with our underlying image. You can use blending modes to actually combine this grid with underlying image. The problem is at the moment this grid is pure white and this will blend pretty harshly with some colors. So I'm going to change the color on the grid itself to one of the colors we used before. And then if I pick something like lighter color in this case, this lets me blend this grid itself with the glow of the streaks very seamlessly. I don't want this grid to appear all over the whole composition. I want this grid to appear only where the stretched text is, mainly these parts. And by using the lighter color, this ensures that this grid doesn't bleed on the pure white colors, even if it's on top of everything. To mask it out, we can use again set matte effect and point it at our text displacement layer. Using this simple effect, we can mask out this grid layer on top of our only specific areas we want to target. Now to add more definition, I'm going to add another shape layer. I'm simply going to add a noise effect to it. And if I use something like 50, we get noise on top of everything. What I'm going to do is change the color of this layer to 50% gray and disable the color noise so we have just uniform noise happening all over the whole thing. So what I want to do is potentially darken out all the previous layers by using one of the darken or multiply modes. As you can see, it adds a little bit of detail in all the layers. It's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to do, first of all, I don't want this noise to appear on text. I want the text to be super sharp. So what I'm going to do again is create another set matte effect on the noise layer itself and point it at text displacement. Now, if I only saw this effect, you can see it only appears where the text layer itself is. If I invert it, it goes everywhere else but the text and the streaks. I don't want that. I want this to appear everywhere except the text here. So I want the noise to appear background and the streaks. And what we can do is use luminance channel. There you go. And it's actually nicely faded throughout the whole layer. There's plenty in the shadows. And as the layer gets brighter, the noise completely disappears. So this is again why it was important in the previous tutorial to set up the gradient layer correctly. So if I unselect this, there you go. It adds a little bit of definition everywhere. It's a little bit too strong for my liking. It might show up okay on the YouTube compression, but I will reduce it to about 50% So it's just in the background. Now I'm going to add one more layer and call it glow plus optics. I want to add overall glow to all the layers. Now by default, After Effects glow effect is pretty cumbersome to use, so you have to play with these settings mostly. But let's see what we can get. Okay, so this is much more subtle. So simply have the one glow effect at really high threshold. So the higher the threshold, the brighter the pixel has to be to glow. Then we have the glow radius, which is pretty big. If I turn this on and off, you can see how everything has this soft glow everywhere. And the intensity is just 0.3. And by duplicating this effect, as you can see, it boosts up the whole glow operation a little bit more. Now to distort this image a little bit more, what I'm going to do is add something called optics. And this effect, if I turn this to something like 75, it distorts the whole image like it's an old lens or TV. So if I use reverse lens distortion, it fits perfectly. So we have a slightly stretched out image edge to edge. And if you duplicate this, you have even stronger effect. So it curves really nicely. One of the last things I'm going to add is a grid on top. So as again, just a simple grid, width and height, keyframe, press U, you can parent one to another, get rid of keyframes. So what I want to do is create a really big grid of something around 200. And I want to have a smaller grid placed exactly within the big one. So if I duplicate this and change the size, nothing really happens. Actually happens something weird because the second grid effect is parented to the first one. So if I just highlight the keyframes, so what I need to do is, if you see, this is pointing to grid, which is this effect, not grid 2. I have to point it to grid number 2, which is fine. And then this, the width, I have to point it at grid 1 width and divide it by, for example, 10. And we have perfect small grid within the big grid. Now, let me just get rid of the keyframes. If I change this to something like 1, everything changes to 1 because the blending mode is still set to none. If we change to normal, we get the first grid and the second grid. So we're basically blending two effects together on the same layer. So this is really cool because now I can animate this and the small grid will always be perfectly spaced out in a square fashion as the big one and spaced out in exactly the same amount. So this is actually pretty cool way to have really complex grid done very easily. So now to finish this image off, I'm going to add optics compensation effect. And on the previous one, we were going 75 on the plus side. So I'm going to go something like maybe 50. There you go, so it curves nicely. Now the problem is this effect, it kind of changes the size of the layer. So you actually see the edges. And if you try to play with the scale, nothing happens because it actually ignores the scale of the layer itself. To fix that, you simply have to add transform effect. And if you change the scale, there you go. You're actually stretching all the effects added before and transforming them to the size you need. Perfect, that blends very nicely. Now it's still pretty strong for my liking, so I'm going to actually change the size of the main grid to something like 0.5 and the small one to 0.7 perhaps. There you go, so it's much more fainted. And to blend it better, I'm going to, let me just bring up my color layers. I'm actually going to change the color of the secondary grid to like a different color. There we go. So it actually shows up a little bit different. So the main grid is actually really prominent and the other one is like fainted within the same kind of color scheme. To fade this grid out, what I'm going to do is actually create a circular shape layer. So simply by creating a circular shape layer, and maybe changing the size to around 1000. So it's pretty big. I'm going to use this layer as a mask for the grid layer itself. And what I'm going to do is repeat the edge pixels, blur out the edges, and if we take this mask, so we have our grid with all the effects added, and the grid mask with added box blur, and using the alpha inverted matte, we're simply masking out the center so the grid gently fades over. So if I unsolo this, you can see how the center is empty from the grid overlay and it slowly fades in from the edges. Now it's still pretty prominent, so what I'm going to do is actually change the blending mode of the grid layer itself. So something like color dodge will let me blend the white portion of the big grid and actually highlight whenever they hit specific colors in the background, as you can see. So there's like extra details. Now as the finishing touch to animate this grid layer, so I'm going to solo it. 2 keyframes loop out with ping pong expression, going from really big to smaller and back again. Make it like really big. And if I turn on this little graph, I can see actually how the expression behaves. And we are done. It required a little bit of expression setting up, but once it's done, the whole thing is pretty robust. And hopefully this part was more interesting than the previous one, especially since we actually get to play with a lot of blending modes, lots of different effects, how to blend them all together one with another, and how to get interesting effects by using stuff like Colorama. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll make sure that the project file is available to download for free on Gumroad, so you can poke around and see how the whole thing was built and simply copy and paste expressions to your projects if you wish so.